Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been on this journey for a while now, uncovering secrets and exploring the myths of legends surrounding history's most feared books. We've opened grimoires, delved into ancient religious texts, and really tried to unpack why these works have garnered such a reputation. For those joining us for the first time, this is Occult Archives, the segment where we kind of pull back the curtain on all of that.
Yeah, exactly. We look at the whispers of forbidden knowledge, the echoes of ancient beliefs, all the stuff that gives these books that aura.
Exactly. And today we're on episode 96, which means we've gone through a lot of these texts. But this one, the Aphorisms of Cardan, it's subtitled Secrets of Stars, Fate, and Celestial Influence.
Yeah, and it's not just some dusty old book of predictions. It's a deep dive into the mind of this incredible thinker, Girolamo Cardano, the 16th century polymath. I mean, the guy did everything. We're talking about a collection of his insights.
And not just any collection. This particular edition, from 1675, was curated and translated by William Lilly, a super influential English astrologer in the 17th century. So, we're getting a very specific lens on Cardano's thinking here.
Right, exactly. And I think what's going to be really fascinating for our listeners is that while this is definitely a historical text, the themes Cardano touches on, they're still so relevant today. I mean, we're talking about the very nature of knowledge, how we acquire it, how we can be sure of anything.
Yeah, and that big question, right? Fate versus free will, this idea of destiny being written in the stars. And then, how all of that ties into this sense of the cosmos being this interconnected web influencing everything on Earth.
Totally. So as we go through these aphorisms, these little nuggets of wisdom, you'll see how wide-ranging Cardano's thought really was. We're going from those big questions about knowing to very practical stuff like understanding birth charts, making forecasts, even interpreting things like eclipses.
Yeah, and it goes even further, right?
Yeah.
Into things like illnesses, choosing the right time for important actions, weather patterns, agriculture, you name it. He's like, let's bring the cosmos down to Earth. So, buckle up, folks.
Yeah, get ready for a ride through history and the stars.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Cardano's got this section called General Aphorisms, and it lays out some core ideas about knowledge. Right off the bat, Aphorism 1 kind of sets the stage. He talks about how vast art or science is. We might use those terms interchangeably today compared to, the shortness of human life.
Yeah, he's saying we just don't have enough time to experience and master everything ourselves. And because of that, sound judgment, it's not easy to come by.
Right. So what's the solution? Well, Cardano, he's a big advocate for, standing on the shoulders of giants, study the great thinkers who came before, look at the work they've done.
Exactly. And he emphasizes experimentation, figuring out how things work in the natural world. And for Cardano, that includes understanding the celestial bodies, those patterns in the sky. And above all, love truth, man. That's the key.
Love the truth. Okay, I like that. So Aphorism 2 builds on this and kind of sets up how he views astrology. He talks about the principles of art, which are reason, our senses, and experience. How we gather information.
Right. And he contrasts those with what he calls the principles of operations, which are, well, the stuff of the cosmos, the planets, the different parts of the heavens, the fixed stars. Those are the players on the celestial stage.
Yeah.
And their positions, their relationships, that's what really matters.
So he's saying it's not just about looking up and seeing stars. It's about understanding how they all work together, how those relationships play out. Okay, Aphorism 3 gets really interesting. It's about the limits of knowledge. Cardano, he's very clear that some things we can know for sure.
Yeah, like the cyclical nature of the heavens, the way things repeat. But even with something like the sun's yearly journey, there's still a lot we don't know. And then there are things that are theoretically knowable, but super hard to pin down.
Right. He gives the example of the exact moment of the equinox. It's like, okay, we know it happens, but getting down to the second, that's a whole other challenge.
Yeah.
And then there are those things that, well, maybe they're just beyond us.
Yeah, things like, the complete interaction of every single star and how that affects us. And it's this sense of, we can't know everything. There are limits to human understanding.
Which leads us to Aphorism 4, and this is a good one for all of us. Cardano says it's worse to think you know something when you don't than to just admit ignorance.
Yeah, that false confidence can be a real trap. It stops us from learning, from being open to new information.
Aphorism 5, though, it kind of offers a bit of hope for those of us who maybe haven't spent our whole lives buried in books. Cardano says excellent judgment can sometimes be more useful than loads of learning without the wisdom to apply it.
Right, but he's not dissing learning altogether. He's just saying judgment is the key. And for him, that judgment is best informed by learning, but also by aligning yourself with the natural world and those celestial influences.
Okay, so working with the cosmos, not against it. I like that. Aphorism 8 gets right to the heart of what it means to be an astrologer. Cardano's making a point about integrity here, saying a good astrologer needs a solid grounding in natural philosophy.
Yeah, they need to understand how the natural world works. And because the stars, the planets, they're always in motion, absolute certainty about the future, well, that's just not possible.
Right, so good astrologers, they're cautious. They don't make wild predictions or claim to know everything for sure. It's more about understanding tendencies, potentials, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And Aphorism 9, it builds on that by talking about the inherent value of truth. Knowing things, even if they're not all sunshine and roses, it's a good thing.
Right. He says anticipating good things brings joy, but knowing potential bad stuff might happen. Well, that lets us prepare, maybe even avoid it entirely, or at least deal with it better.
Exactly. It's like knowledge is power, even when it's not the most pleasant knowledge. And then Aphorism 10, it really lays out the foundation for Cardano's whole worldview.
Yeah, he says heaven, the cosmos, it's God's instrument. It's how the divine acts upon and governs the world, everything down here on earth. So that's setting the stage for how he views the relationship between the celestial and the earthly.
And Aphorism 14, it dives into that relationship in a really thought-provoking way. It's this idea that even when we think we're making free choices, we might actually be influenced by the stars, especially if we're driven by what he calls corrupt affections and ignorance.
So like our base desires and a lack of understanding can make us more susceptible to those celestial influences. It kind of makes you think, right, how much free will do we really have?
It does. And then Aphorism 15, it's a reminder to be humble when it comes to interpreting the stars. Don't overstate give judgments in general terms unless the evidence is super strong.
Right. Don't be that person who's like, I see a tall, dark stranger in your future. Okay, Aphorism 17, this one's interesting. It talks about why astrological predictions aren't always accurate.
Yeah, and Cardano, he has a few theories. One is that, well, maybe we just haven't mastered the art of astrology yet. It's still evolving. And then there's the simple fact that even if you're a skilled astrologer, you might not live long enough to see if your predictions for a newborn come true.
That's kind of a bummer, right? It's like you're working on this puzzle but might not get to see the whole picture.
Yeah.
Aphorism 20 gets super specific about the fixed stars and how to evaluate their influence.
Yeah, he lays out all these factors. You've got their magnitude, how bright they appear, their inherent nature, proximity to the ecliptic, position in the sky, how many stars are clustered together, their first visibility after being hidden. There's a lot to consider.
It's like a checklist for stargazers. And Aphorism 23, it gets into the nuances of astrological aspects, those angular relationships between planets.
Right, and he points out that even aspects traditionally seen as bad, like squares and oppositions, can be friendly if there's something called reception between the planets involved. Basically, if they're each in a sign where the other one rules or is exalted, it's a kind of mutual dignity, softening the blow.
So it's not always cut and dry with these aspects. It's more about the whole picture, the interplay between all those factors. Okay, so we've got these general aphorisms as a foundation. Now let's get into the really personal stuff, right? The aphorisms relating to nativities.
Yeah, the birth charts, those snapshots of the heavens at the moment you were born. Aphorism 2 in this section makes a pretty intense claim linking unfortunate luminary placements in the angles of the chart with a predisposition to, well, suicide.
Yeah, and before we go any further, I just want to remind everyone, we're presenting this stuff as it appears in the source, a 17th century text. Times have changed, so have our views on things like mental health.
Right, exactly. It's important to keep that historical context in mind. So Aphorism 4, this one's about Saturn and Mars hanging out in the same sign. And if they happen to be in Taurus in the 4th house, which rules home and foundations, watch out.
Yeah, because when your directed ascendant lines up with them, you might experience a bad fall or even be in danger from a collapsing building. It's pretty intense imagery.
Definitely. And Aphorism 5 dives into those different qualities of zodiac signs. The fixed signs, generally they're about learning and stability, except for Scorpio in this case. Common signs, they're more about manners and communication, except for Virgo. And the movable signs, riches, except Capricorn.
Okay, so lots of exceptions to the rules.
Got it.
Got it. And he says if most of your planets are piled up in Virgo, Scorpio, or Capricorn, that's generally not great.
Yeah, it's about balance. You want those planetary energies spread out. But then Aphorism 7 gives us a good example. The moon in Taurus, separating from a rough time with Jupiter, heading into a nice trine with the sun that's good for wealth.
Okay, so some hope for us Taurus moons. And then aphorism 8 introduces this concept of the abscissor, which sounds pretty scary.
Yeah, it's not a planet itself, but it's calculated based on the planets, and it's associated with cutting life short. If it falls in an angular house with a bad planet like Saturn or Mars, watch out.
Okay, so that's one to look out for. Aphorism 10 gives us some pretty bold character sketches based on the rising sign.
Right. Aries rising, handsome, grave, commanding presence. Scorpio rising, great liars. You know, typical Scorpio.
Oh boy, that's going to ruffle some feathers. Aphorism 11 gets into relationship stuff and says, if the moon in Scorpio is squaring Saturn in Leo or opposing him in Taurus, marriage and kids are probably not happening.
Yeah, and to add insult to injury, Saturn in Aquarius, woman hater. Again, we're just reporting what the text says here.
Right. Aphorism 14, this one links Mars in the ascendant with facing dangers and potentially getting a facial scar. So if you've got Mars rising and a scar on your cheek, you know who to blame.
It's like a little cosmic battle wound. Aphorism 16 highlights the importance of Jupiter and the moon when it comes to overall happiness.
Yeah, he says if they're weak and afflicted, you're going to be unhappy no matter how good the rest of your chart looks.
Oof, that's rough. And then aphorism 17, well, it's about Venus aspecting the Lord of the Ascendant while also being in aspect with Saturn.
Yeah, and this is where things get a little tricky. According to Cardano, this configuration can indicate an inclination towards what he calls sodomy, or at least an attraction to older, less attractive women. We're just presenting the language as it appears, folks.
Right. Times were different, and so were the words used. Moving on to aphorism 18, we're back to money matters. If Venus and Jupiter are hanging out in the 7th house, and the moon's smiling on them from her own signs, especially with the dragon's head involved, that's good for wealth through marriage.
Okay, so find a partner with good Venus and Jupiter placements. Noted. Aphorism 20 links Venus in the heart of the sun, or a planet aspecting the moon, while also being aligned with Coriolanus, that big star in Leo, with achieving great honors.
It's interesting how he's weaving in fixed stars here and not just the planets. Aphorism 22 is about children born outside of wedlock, and he says their charts often show the ascendant aspecting the moon, but not the planet signifying the father. There are also usually a bunch of unfortunate aspects between the lords of the 4th and 2nd houses and the moon.
So some pretty specific astrological indicators for a specific social situation. Aphorism 23, it's a classic rags to riches story. If you've got the Jupiter-Mars trine in the 10th, Sun with the dragon's head, and Moon with Coriolanus, you might just rise from humble beginnings to something grand.
It's like the cosmic lottery ticket. Aphorism 25 brings us back to those darker predictions. Malefics in the angles, afflicted, not good. Sudden or public death, potentially. And he even gets specific about how you might go. Sun afflicted, weapon or fire, moon afflicted, hanging or drowning.
Okay, that's getting pretty intense. Aphorism 27 links the moon opposite the sun, especially with those nebulous stars, to problems with eyesight. And if the moon's in the 7th, afflicted by both malefics, potentially blindness.
It's amazing how he connects these specific placements to physical issues. Aphorism 28 is for all the wordsmiths out there. If you've got Jupiter, Venus, Mercury, and the moon all playing nice together, that's good for eloquence and sweet speech.
And he even says, poets are always born, not made. So if you were born with Jupiter in Virgo and the moon in Pisces, maybe you're a poet and didn't even know it.
There you go. Aphorism 30 gives us a framework for looking at family in the chart. The 5th house from the ascendant, that's your kids, and the 9th house, grandkids.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And he points out that people born with different rising signs will tend to have kids with different personalities, even if those kids are born around the same time. Aphorism 31, this one's a little sensitive. Moon with a dragon's tail.
Yeah, not great. Might raise questions about the mother's honesty, potentially even infidelity. And the kid born under this influence might be ill-mannered and just generally unfortunate.
Aphorism 35, this one gets back to the moon and her cycles. It's about how the moon at your birth often returns to a position related to where she was at your conception, whether it's the same sign, the opposite sign, a planet she aspected, or even her own signs. And the ascendant at birth often relates to the moon's position at conception too.
Right. It's all connected, those cycles of time. Aphorism 37, back to relationships again. Certain Mars and Venus placements for women, well, let's just say they suggest a tendency towards infidelity. Again, we're just relaying the info.
Yep. Aphorism 40, this one's for those who want to be known. If you got most of your planets above the horizon, that's good for fame and recognition.
And if those planets are the speedy ones, like Mercury and Venus, you'll be super dexterous, good at handling all sorts of stuff.
Aphorism 42, We're back to speech and communication. Mercury in Pisces, or that sign rising. You might have speech impediments, or just say things without thinking first.
Oops, foot and mouth. Happens to the best of us. Aphorism 45, it's a cautionary tale about Jupiter, that planet of good fortune. Because if he's in Capricorn near the midheaven, yeah, you might get that good fortune, but it could come through violence or injustice. Not exactly a happy ending.
So be careful what you wish for, right? Aphorism 46 brings back those fixed stars and says, if your moon's receiving good aspects from lots of planets or hangs out with a royal fixed star, fame is probably in your future.
The stars are aligning for you. Aphorism 47, this one's for the deep thinkers. If Sun and Jupiter rule the ninth house and also the places of Mercury, Moon, and the Ascendant, and they're all vibing well together, people are going to hang on your every word.
Like oracle status. Aphorism 48 gives us some contrasting character traits based on planetary placements. Sun and Jupiter in the second, gallant and noble. Saturn with Mars or Mercury in the seventh, sordidly covetous. Not the best combo.
No, not really. Aphorism 51, all hail the Sun in Leo. If you've got this placement, you're probably doing pretty well in life, not likely to experience much want.
And if Leo's rising too, even better. Boosts your spirit and reasoning abilities. Aphorism 53, back to Venus and her sometimes less than savory side. Venus in Mars's house or exaltation. Cardano's word is filthy lust.
Again, we're just reading the text. Aphorism 54, Moon in Aquarius or Pisces. Might not be popular with the elites.
Tough break. Aphorism 56 gets into the idea of location and destiny. If your rising sign matches the rising sign of the city you were born in, you're more likely to be successful there.
Like you're astrologically in tune with the place. Aphorism 57, we're back to financial success. If the lord of your second house applies to Jupiter, especially if Jupiter rules your ascendant too, you're probably going to be pretty happy about your money situation.
Sign me up for that. Aphorism 61 gets into Saturn's more challenging side. Saturn in the 12th could mean gout. Saturn in the 6th, lasting disease or imprisonment. Not fun?
No, not at all. Aphorism 62, this one's a little scary. Moon sandwich between Sun and Mars, or conjunct either of them. Shirt life, potentially. Like, traded the cradle for a grave.
Heavy stuff. Aphorism 64, back to love and its complications. Venus poorly placed under the sun's rays or otherwise afflicted.
Yeah, love's probably going to bring you some trouble.
Aphorism 65 makes some pretty bold claims about certain signs. Watery signs, especially Scorpio. Traitors. Moon ruling the ascendant in Scorpio. You might betray your boss. And this applies to cities, too. A city with this in its chart. Prone to rebellion.
Okay, so watch out for those Scorpios. Aphorism 66, this one's about the Mars-Mercury conjunction. And it's a mixed bag. Can make you kind of a jerk, but also super talented in the arts.
Right, so maybe there's a link between talent and, well, not being the nicest person. Aphorism 67, Mars poorly placed in the ninth house. Cardano calls them liars and atheists.
Again, we're just reading what's in the text. Aphorism 68, this one's about mental balance. Good Mercury, but bad Moon. You understand things well, but your judgment's not so great. Could be good at advising others, but terrible at managing your own life. Aphorism 71 lays out a really difficult combination. Saturn and Mars aspecting each other while the luminaries are stuck in the 6th, 8th, or 12th houses.
That's a recipe for incurable disease and a miserable life. Yikes. Aphorism 72 says, Moon in midheaven in Capricorn with Saturn or Mars in the 4th means infamy. Even worse if Mars is in Taurus and Moon's in Scorpio.
Sounds like a lot of trouble. Aphorism 73, this one's kind of funny. Venus with Saturn and Mars opposite the Moon. You're a fool who thinks you're a philosopher.
Ouch. Aphorism 76 says Mars and Mercury poorly placed in conjunct the Moon make thieves and robbers, even worse with Saturn involved. And they'll probably get what's coming to them.
Karma's Aphorism 77, Moon conjunct Saturn in an angle. Even if you're rich and powerful, you might end up poor.
Talk about a fall from grace.
Yeah.
Aphorism 79 says, even if your chart looks bad for wealth and honor, if your moon's hanging out with a lucky fixed star, you might get a taste of power, but it won't last.
It's like a fleeting moment of glory. Aphorism 80 lays out a chart so packed with challenging aspects that the native's life will be just full of crazy events.
Like one thing after another. Aphorism 81, straight up bad news. Saturn, Mars, and the dragon's head in the 4th house. Sudden death.
No sugarcoating there. Aphorism 82, Moon passing through the beams from Mars to Saturn in a nocturnal chart. Expect a lot of annoyances, especially from women.
Aphorism 83 gives us a recipe for being super smart. If Saturn, Venus, Jupiter, and the Moon are all nicely aspecting Mercury, and neither Saturn nor the Moon are in the ascendant, and there's no planet in an angle, you're probably a genius.
Lots of conditions for that one. Aphorism 84, Sun Peregrine and Corde Coeli squaring the moon in the seventh. You might become a leader but die suddenly, so, enjoy the power while it lasts.
Not the best trade-off. Aphorism 86 talks about how those planetary placements in the houses can bring big changes in fortune. Malefics and angles, benefics and succeedance, or a combust moon with a strong ruler, or Jupiter dignified in a cadent house.
Yeah, all of those can mean going from rags to riches or vice versa. Aphorism 87, Moon, Venus, and Mars all conjunct. Bad time to be born, apparently. This is the chart of Neros and wicked people.
Aphorism 88. It's all about Jupiter and how his placement affects your kids and your wealth. Elevated and slightly afflicted, you might lose your kids but keep your estate.
Descending and not so afflicted. You'll have kids, but maybe not a lot of wealth to pass on. Aphorism 89, Saturn in or ruling the 7th or 8th, but not threatening violent death. You're probably going to die of grief.
That's a sad one. Aphorism 90, Malefic's peregrine in the 7th, but ruling the ascendant. Say goodbye to your wife or your enemies.
Aphorism 91 makes a big statement. If you've got no planets above the Earth or in the ascendant, you're probably not going to live long or achieve great things. Visibility matters.
It does. Aphorism 92, want to know how many wives you'll have. Look at planetary conjunctions, common signs, the moon's applications to planets at certain ages, and any signs of, previous wives dying, the whole process.
Astrology gets into the details. Aphorism 93, Mars or Mercury afflicting the elevated lord of the 7th. You might end up killing your spouse or an enemy, maybe even with poison. Yikes.
Aphorism 94, this one's for the ladies. Mars under the sun's beams in your chart might suggest promiscuity, especially with servants. But a good Venus means you're more discreet and maybe dealing with higher class folks.
Aphorism 95, all about kids and whether you'll have them. Malefics afflicting the 5th house and its ruler could mean having kids and then losing them, or not having kids at all.
Aphorism 96, planetary placements can even affect how much you love your kids. If the lord of the geniture is a malefic that doesn't aspect the 5th house well, or a benefic that aspects it badly, you might not be the most loving parent.
Aphorism 98, this one's specific. Mars right on the midheaven cusp, but not ruling the ascendant. If you live long enough, you might get murdered.
Aphorism 99, even if your chart looks good for success, if your parents' charts had those same significators afflicted, you're probably going to have a rough start in life. Like, you're carrying some generational baggage.
And finally, to wrap up this section on nativities, Aphorism 100 just lays out a whole bunch of really challenging placements. Malefics with the luminaries, planets all piled up in cadent houses, afflicted luminaries and benefics, retrograde planets, solitary Mars above the Earth. It's a whole list of things that make for a difficult chart.
So if your chart has any of those, maybe just blame it on the stars.
Yeah.
All right, moving on to aphorisms concerning revolutions. This is all about those yearly forecasts, those cycles within cycles.
Right. Aphorism 1 explains the different ways to calculate these revolution charts. The most common is the sun's return to its natal position, but you can also look at the returns of other planets, especially the moon, Saturn, and Jupiter.
Aphorism 2 gives a very specific and not so great prediction. If the dragon's tail afflicts the lord of your ascendant natally, and then the moon joins it in your revolution, and the lord of the 8th is poorly placed and aspecting the moon in the revelation, that year might be your last.
Heavy stuff. Aphorism 3 says if you've got strong malefics in your birth chart and then in your revolution the moon applies to a Martian fixed star, watch out for violence.
Either you'll be doing it or it'll be done to you.
Aphorism 4 makes the point that these revolution charts can have effects that last for a few years, not just the 1 year the chart is for. Sometimes things just take a while to play out, or the events themselves have long-lasting consequences. Aphorism 5 says if the ascendant of your revolution matches your natal ascendant, something promised in your birth chart is probably going to happen that year, especially if the moon or the lord of the ascendant are also in their natal places. It's like an echo.
Aphorism 6 warns about a retrograde inferior planet under the sun's beams, or a superior planet afflicted by a malefic in the revolution. That can be a real danger to your life that year.
Aphorism 7, this one's about love and marriage. If Jupiter in your revolution aspects Moon or Venus, or is in an angle that corresponds to their natal placements, you might be getting hitched that year, if you're of age, that is.
Aphorism 8 lays out a bunch of difficult placements in both the natal and revolution charts that can be really dangerous, potentially even fatal. Debilitated life significator, combust fortunes, elevated malefics aspecting the sun, ascendant, or moon. Not a good combo.
Aphorism 9, more health stuff. If you've got a weak birth chart in terms of longevity and then 3 planets conjunct in your revolution, especially in the 6th house, you might be getting seriously ill that year.
Aphorism 12, moon conjunct Saturn in the revolution, with Saturn squaring the ascendant. Could mean your body's suffering because of some mental anguish you're going through.
Aphorism 14, this one's a mouthful. Moon agreeing with Saturn natally, then being conjunct him in the revolution after age 40, or a full moon opposite Saturn with contrary latitude from the 6th to the 8th. That points to a weird and potentially deadly disease.
Aphorism 15 says, if the houses of your natal ascendant or moon square or oppose malefics in the revolution, expect trouble. And if the moon's actually conjunct them, you're probably the one causing the trouble.
And if those malefics rule bad houses in your birth chart, you're both harming others and getting harmed yourself. Aphorism 17 says, a year's going to be bad for your health if a lot of your high legical placements in the revolution are afflicted.
So those life-giving points in your chart, you want them to be strong. Aphorism 18 explains how those afflicted planets in the revolution actually manifest their effects. It's when they apply to the Lord of the sign they're in.
So it's all about those aspects, those connections. And lastly, Aphorism 19 reminds us that the 6th house is super important for health matters, both in the natal chart and the revolution.
Yeah, the 6th house is always about those daily routines and, unfortunately, also about illness. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with those revolutions. Let's move on to the next section, which is all about decumbatures.
Right, decumbatures, those are the charts we cast when someone falls ill. It's like a medical snapshot. And Aphorism 1 lays out the basics. The ascendant, that's the patient. 7th house, the disease.
Luminaries, the patient's strength,
Mm-hmm.
malefics, strength of the disease, and the 8th house is always involved because,
Right, it's about those potential outcomes. Aphorism 2, this one's a good sign. If the moon applies to planets that are opposite in nature to the disease, especially if they're benefics, the patient's probably going to get better.
So those good lunar aspects can bring healing. Aphorism 3, this one's not so good. If the moon, when you first get sick, is under the sun's beams or with the dragon's tail, Saturn, or Mars, that's really bad, especially for older folks.
Yeah, and even conjunctions with benefics can be dangerous in this situation. And if the moon's in the same sign as those planets were in your birth chart, not good at all, could be fatal.
Aphorism 4 gets into those 4 humors, that old medical theory. Mars, Jupiter, and Venus rule blood. Mars and the sun rule choler. Moon and Venus rule phlegm. And Saturn and Mercury rule melancholy.
And Mars, Mercury, and the sun together, that's black collar, the worst kind. Aphorism 5 connects planets with the types of diseases they cause and how long those diseases will last. Saturn, long chronic illnesses. Venus, more moderate stuff.
Mercury, all over the place, lots of variety. Moon, things that come and go like epilepsy. Jupiter and the sun, short illnesses. And Mars, acute, intense, and often fast-acting.
Aphorism 6 is a good tip for interpreting these decumbature charts. If the illness seems milder in the chart than it is in reality, the real problem might be rooted in the patient's birth chart. It's like the stars were already aligned for this to happen.
Aphorism 9, practical advice for the physicians out there. Don't give your patients strong medicine when the moon's in a fixed sign. It won't work as well. And especially not in Aries, Taurus, or Capricorn, because it'll make them nauseous.
Aphorism 10, more timing advice. Want to purge your patient. Moon and the Lord of the Ascendant should be descending. Want them to throw up? Those should be ascending.
Aphorism 11, purging, vomiting, bleeding, dealing with skin eruptions, all that stuff. Do it when the moon's in a moist sign, preferably Pisces or Cancer. Those watery signs are good for expelling fluids.
Makes sense. Aphorism 13, Moon conjunct Venus in the decumbature chart helps to expel choler. Moon with Jupiter helps with melancholy.
Aphorism 15 links specific lunar phases with illness. Get sick at the full moon. It's probably from an excess of some humor. Get sick during a lunar eclipse. Your vital spirits are weak.
Aphorism 16 distinguishes between Oriental and Occidental malefics in the decumbature chart. Oriental ones cause diseases, Occidental ones cause defects. It's all about the direction.